Hello. Today we're going to talk about the changes in supply chain and demand due to COVID-19. My name is Jay Staley. You'll be hearing from Dylan, Mackenzie, and Aaron throughout the presentation. First, Dylan's going to start out talking about the impacts that COVID-19's had on supply chains.
My name is Dylan. I'll be talking about some of the key issues involving the supply chain and traffic flow changes due to COVID-19. The supply shock that started in China in February and the demand shock that followed as the global economy shut down revealed weaknesses in the production strategies and supply chains of firms just about everywhere. Shortages of pharmaceuticals and temporary trade restrictions, critical medical supplies, and other products highlighted their weaknesses. Those developments, combined with the US-China trade war, have triggered a rise in economic nationalism. As a consequence of all this, manufacturers worldwide are under increased competitive and political pressures to increase their domestic production, grow employment in their home countries, reduce their dependence on sources that are viewed as risky, and rethink their use of lean manufacturing strategies that involve minimizing the amount of inventory held in their global supply chains. One example of a key issue with changes in traffic flows and supply chains due to COVID-19 is a group of chemicals known as nucleoside phosphonamides and the associated regions that are used for creating DNA and RNA sequences. These are essential for all companies developing DNA or mRNA-based COVID-19 vaccines and DNA-based drug therapies, but many of the key precursor materials come from South Korea and China, where the virus originated. Manufacturers in most industries have turned to suppliers and subcontractors who narrowly focus on just one field, and those specialists, in turn, usually must rely on many others. Such an arrangement offers benefits. You have a lot of flexibility in what goes into your product, and you can incorporate the latest technology, but you are left vulnerable when you depend on a single supplier somewhere deep in your network for a crucial component or material. If that supplier produces the item in only one plant or country, your disruption risks are even higher. This directly correlates to how China and South Korea create many of the key precursor materials that are within the drug therapies and vaccines administered to combat COVID-19, and how difficult it is to obtain those materials from other places. In the long run, though, it would be a mistake to cut China completely out of our supply picture. The country's deep supplier networks, its flexible workforce, and its large and efficient ports and transportation infrastructure mean that it will remain a highly competitive source for years to come. And because China has the second largest economy in the world, it is important that firms maintain a presence to sell in their markets and obtain competitive intelligence. And Aaron will continue on with that.
Thanks, Dylan. I'll be talking more about the domestic effects of supply chain traffic flow changes due to COVID-19. The pandemic didn't just alter the economy and supply chains during the shutdowns and quarantines. Once the worst of the pandemic was dying down and people were returning to their businesses and offices, but they returned a huge job market for those recovering businesses. Businesses have struggled with returning due to being understaffed. There were a record 8.3 million job openings post-pandemic, an all-time record in the United States. The issue with staffing coincides with another huge issue in the supply chain, which is not having enough inventory to avoid running out of stock. One section of the supply chain that has been impacted from the inventories is the inventories of cars and homes. The inventories of cars and homes are at record lows right now, showing that car sales have enough inventory for 1 month of sales and 4.4 months of sales for homes. Compare this to the pre-pandemic levels of 2 months for cars and 5.5 months for homes. Low amounts of inventory causes issues in the supply chain, whether it be not being able to handle an increased demand or from not being able to get the required parts. Taking a closer look into the auto sector, which accounts for about 1/3 of the price increases seen from the pandemic, we can clearly see signs of supply chain disruptions. Automakers underestimated the demand for cars after the pandemic. They expected low amounts of demand and therefore canceled orders of semiconductors. Semiconductors have a long lead time and are being used in other job markets as well. This created a bottleneck in the production of vehicles, with automakers trying to find semiconductors to finish the vehicles. The semiconductor is not the only input that faced this issue from automakers, just the most prevalent example for this supply chain disruption. Automakers face this challenge with thousands of parts that make up a vehicle, with prices changing from the inputs to the materials themselves, like steel and plastic. The U.S. markets have gone through significant changes in the past 2 years, but will slowly adjust. The impact of the slow changes can be costly, especially for smaller businesses. Addressing these vulnerabilities in the supply chain will be the way to recover from such a devastating event in the form of the pandemic. And Jay will continue.
Thanks, Aaron. COVID-19 made it clear that there needed to be changes made to the traditional supply chain to account for disruptions that may come in the future. McKinsey, a management consulting company, conducted the report, How COVID-19 is Reshaping Supply Chains. In the report, it was found that 93% of respondents told them that they intended to make their supply chains far more flexible, agile, and resilient. During the pandemic, traffic flows were cut off between countries, causing mass shortages of necessities. This has caused many firms to focus on the regionalization of their production in a way to safeguard against these shortages. An example of these shortages is looking at the automobile industry and chip manufacturing, which can be seen in the graphic on the slide. Even though some of these companies host most of their production in the United States, they rely on Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers to ship them the chips. This has caused a major backup in the production of vehicles. To combat these issues, firms have focused efforts on increasing their visibility of Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted many problems in supply chain management for products and industries. Perhaps one of the biggest problems highlighted by the pandemic is how companies manage their inventory. Due to inventory storage cost and shrinkage costs, many companies have focused on minimizing their on-hand inventory in the past. This became a problem when the virus caused a universal breakdown of supply chains and traffic flows, combined with panic buying by consumers as many companies didn't have sufficient safety stock to accommodate for the demand. In the report, Reinventing Supply Chain for the Future by Gartner, it was found that post-pandemic, 43% of supply chain professionals said that their companies are investing in safety stock now. An additional 11% will do so in the next 2 years. Most companies use turnover ratios to determine the amount of inventory to keep on hand, but this doesn't account for the uncertain demand and seasonality of products. Rob O'Brien for the Logistics Bureau proposes that the current method for inventory management is outdated, crediting the pandemic for highlighting these issues. O'Brien states, if anything, the unprecedented disruptiveness of COVID crisis has highlighted the flaws in the traditional methods of inventory calculation, which are based mainly on historical demand analysis. The hardships that COVID-19 presented to supply chains have caused many companies to think about how to improve their processes. Next, Mackenzie's going to go over some of the tools that these companies are leveraging to help combat some of these issues.
Thanks, Jay. Many companies with supply chains that have been affected by the COVID-19 outbreak are now making changes in their supply chains, including changes in suppliers, ordering, and distribution. In this class, we learned about the tiers of company suppliers, due to the shortages and shutdowns, companies are buying raw materials and inventory that are in short supply ahead of time by working with Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers to get a hold of these limited supplies. We also learned about assembly processes. Many companies are utilizing overtime assembly capacity as much as they can to recover from previous shutdowns. We have learned how to determine where the bottleneck in a process is and how the bottleneck can be reduced or redistributed. Due to shortages in the overall supply chain, companies are communicating more with Tier 1 and Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers to understand where their capacity constraints and bottlenecks are that will be affecting the timing of their supply chain. One of the concepts we worked with in class, available inventory, can be used by businesses to help bridge the gap in supply shortages and keep their production flowing. There is often a lot of inventory that sits in Tier 2 and Tier 3 manufacturing facilities that can be utilized in times of shortages. Even things like spare parts and remanufactured stock can help. This can be done by estimating the available inventory that sits along their supply chain. Another concept we learned about in class is days of supply. This can be used to estimate the available inventory that sits in Tier 2 and Tier 3 manufacturing facilities to determine what of that inventory can be utilized. In operations management, we learned about lead times and how they can affect the timing in a process. During this post-pandemic time, as distribution is getting back to normal, companies are buying future air transportation as supply and capacity become more available in an attempt to shorten lead times from ocean freight, which has been a huge part of the shortage problem. As we learned in class, many of these preventative actions, such as buying raw materials and inventory ahead of time, overtime assembly capacity, and future air transportation, will cause higher costs for the company and may raise prices and affect the demand of customers.